Hi, everybody. I'm James Enzo Forney. I am co-host of the VPOD show, Inside the Chicago Outfit. I became fascinated over the years with a lot of different characters from Chicago, and this is an exciting time to put together the real inside stories of what goes on inside the underground of Chicago. I'd like to introduce my co-host right now, Joe Seifert.
Hi, I'm Joey Seifert. I co-authored the book Deadly Associates and currently producer on Deadly Associates, the series.
I'm Paul Whitcomb, and I'm an attorney. I've been studying the outfit for about 30 years. Back in the early 90s, I was federal law clerk for several major mob trials and got to interact with some of the people that we're going to talk about as these shows unfold. I also have been a defense attorney in outfit cases, and I continue to practice primarily in the area of criminal law.
I'm Camillus Robinson. I'm a writer and researcher. I've been working on the Gangland Wire podcast for about 3 years now. I've written long articles about the Teamsters and the mafia influence therein. I have written pieces about the Chicago outfit and the Chop Shop Wars, and I'm currently working on my first book.
Thanks, Cam, Joe, Paul. We're excited to get started. This show is going to cover a wide swath of what the history of the Chicago mob is. We're going to go from the heyday to the doomsday. But right now, we're going to take a little dive back in time, and you'll see that as we go through the show, the show is elastic in terms of its time frame, but we're really focused on character. And the first character we're going to talk about is Sam Giancana and the famous Apple-Aiken meeting in 1957. Why is that such a seminal event, Cam?
So 1957 was a really big year for the Chicago outfit, not just the outfit, but for the mafia in general. There were 7 bosses that came to power in 1957, from California all the way to Pittsburgh. You had Frank DeSimone in Los Angeles. You had Nick Savella in Kansas City. You had Sam Giancana in Chicago. You had Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese in New York. So this is a huge turn of the tide in 1957. There was a lot to talk about. And when this meeting took place, there was a lot of conflict building. There was some change of the guard in the Teamsters. Jimmy Hoffa was taking over, and the communists were taking over in Cuba. So there were a lot of things they had discussed, and they were all meeting together, talking about 100 guys were meeting together at this Apple-Aiken meeting. And because of the dynamics around this meeting, it really is a good place to start looking for the modern mob. This is when the second generation took over and really moved forward to what we think of as the mafia today.
So just a quick way to identify this for the viewers, where exactly was this meeting, Apple-Aiken? Where did it take place, and why do you think it took place in that location?
Apple-Aiken is a small village north of the Pennsylvania and New York border. It's in relation to Scranton, and they had a previous meeting in 1956 here, and there was sort of a power struggle between the Buffalo family and Sam Giancana, actually, as far as where to hold it. This meeting was held at the behest of Vito Genovese, a New York boss, and he wanted to hold the meeting to sort of consolidate his power and discuss some other things. But this is a very small village, very isolated, and they believed, because of the isolation and because of the control of Joseph Barbera, who was the boss of the Scranton family, that they would probably be protected, fewer eyes on them in such a rural location.
And didn't we hear that Sam didn't even want to really go there, right? Giancana wanted to hold it here.
He wanted it in Chicago. Because he felt Chicago, he had buttoned up.
Yeah, and so they went to Apple-Aiken. I mean, I don't know how many gangsters were there and mob bosses, but it had to stick out like a sore thumb, right, in that town?
Right. There was a local law enforcement officer, Sam Croswell, and he had some previous dealings with this guy, Joseph Barbera, who was the boss at the time, and he had different labor issues and possessing a firearm. So he had his eye on him. He had his radar was up, and he noticed that his son was going around getting all these hotel rooms. It's not like there's an abundance of hotels, but he was suddenly checking out every hotel room in town. He followed them around. They went to the butcher and bought $400 worth of meat, and this is 1957. That's about $4,000 worth of meat. And so that's not a Saturday barbecue. He has a feeling that something's going on, this Croswell, state trooper. So he decides to keep an eye on the Barbera estate. He knows that something's going to happen there. And there's one road in and out of Barbera's place. You get on the road, you drive in. So he drives up to Barbera's house, and he sees all these Cadillacs and Lincolns, pink Cadillacs, turquoise Lincolns, I mean, very bright colored cars with all these out-of-state plates. And he calls some backup, and they come and they start writing down license plates. Well, they notice that immediately inside. You've got about 80 mob bosses from around the country looking out the window, and they see these state troopers, and you've still got guys coming in. So they stop every car driving in, and they start questioning the guys, where are you going? While they're doing that, all of these guys in silk suits and imported Italian loafers start pouring out of the house. I mean, these guys are 40, 50, 60 years old, running through the woods, jumping through the mud, jumping over barbed wire fences, just pell-mell, just tearing their suits, covered in mud. And there's this cop and these local law enforcement wondering, what's going on. So they grab as many of these guys. They found $300,000 in cash among all of them, in pocket change. And that's their walking around money.
Which has got to be worth 5 or 10 times, what it was. That's almost 60 years ago.
It's more money than anyone I knew had in 1957.
You're calling this an estate. Maybe technically back then it was an estate, but if you look it up nowadays, it's almost like a farm, a small little farm.
Right.
Like they have this small, what I consider a smaller farmhouse.
Right.
Where were they? I mean, they're just setting this up in the living room. He could hold that many people in there?
There's a large patio out back and a big sort of fire pit, sort of a stone fire pit barbecue that they had set up. And they were really grilling steaks, and they were starting to meet up. There were some guys who were outside. And when you look inside the house, you can get some images. It's really large central rooms, sort of what you would consider the great room. And then there's the bedrooms off to the side. You're right, Joe. It's not a huge place, but I think there is the great room and then the big patio outside. And there's plenty of parking. So I think they just all sort of congregated in this area. It's not a massive place, but it is a big isolated property. And I think they thought with the one road in, it might help them keep an eye on things, but that's a double-edged sword because then there's only one way out.
But I'm picturing this one road in, you have 100 Cadillacs or whatever parked all on the side of this little one-lane road.
Right. There's a pretty good-sized parking. You can see some of the pictures where all the cars are just lined up and just walking around writing down the license plates. Now, if the guys had stayed in the house, there'd be no problem. They just stayed inside. But no, I guess it was their first inclination to just run. You see law enforcement coming, you run. But I don't know, stay in the house and we would be well behind in knowing what's going on.
Do you guys think anything like that would happen nowadays?
No, there's
that
no
many
way.
people in one spot at one time?
No.
With cell phones and Snapchat and what we have today, we'd all see it almost in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they go through it on Zoom now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is, this is a time frame when the mafia starts to bubble up into the public consciousness, right? I mean, people suddenly become aware of the fact that it isn't just a New York mob,
Right.
a Providence mob, a Chicago mob, a Milwaukee, Kansas City mob. Now all of a sudden, they're all congregating together.
This was covered as far away as Paris. The Paris newspapers had this. 62 mob chieftains arrested in raid was the newspapers. I think this is where people really came to realize that this was not just a series of dots, but it was an interconnected web of organized groups. They were in communication with one another, whereas previously the FBI had determined that these were local problems. These were local crime groups and local law enforcement can deal with it. What this proves is that there were groups from Los Angeles meeting with groups from Rhode Island, meeting with groups from Dallas and Colorado. I mean, all these guys were there. These were out-of-state plates. These were men of position, and they were all meeting in one place. And that really shocked the public into understanding that there's something bigger going on here. And it really not only woke up the public, but J. Edgar Hoover had to acknowledge and had to direct the FBI's almost full resources away from communists and towards the organized crime.
Wasn't there some resistance on his part, Hoover, to doing this? Because he he made a name for himself, getting the babyface Nelsons and the Dillingers of this world. So these were his poster boys for fighting crime. This didn't fit the model. He couldn't get the press around this initially, so maybe he didn't embrace it. I mean, what's your understanding of that?
It was a huge embarrassment for Hoover. Just as you said, Jim, for decades, he had insisted that there was not a national organized crime network, that these were local problems, as Camillus has said, and that he wanted to focus on chasing communists and getting them out of Hollywood, for example. And then all of a sudden we have 80 to 100 national mob chieftains meeting together. He had to admit that something was wrong. And of course, one has to be very suspicious of why J. Edgar Hoover, for all those years, was unwilling to acknowledge what most people in law enforcement knew for a very long time. This was not the first meeting of the National Commission of the Mob, not by a long stretch.
Right, so in other words, he may have had knowledge, but he didn't want to act on that knowledge. We don't have necessarily evidence to present about that, but there wasn't a motivation on his part to declare like this is the way in advance of things like RICO and the national syndicates and stuff. There is no acknowledgement yet that this is really a national problem, not just a local problem.
Sure, and the mob had been meeting together since the 20s in Atlantic City. There had been meetings in Chicago in the early 30s, in New York, in all kinds of places, but this was the first one that it was undeniable. Because of this one state trooper, all of a sudden it went worldwide. There is a nationwide criminal organization in the United States, and the FBI was forced to do something about it.
And it did show that they were organized. They were communicating with each other all over.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Edgar Croswell was the state trooper.
Good.
There was a movie made about him.
I'm assuming Edgar Croswell is not necessarily still of this earth, or is it?
We
might have to
He would be up
double check
there.
that.
Yeah, we'll check it.
Okay. So who's our representative from Chicago? Who's coming in?
We actually have three, which is so interesting. We have, of course, Tony Accardo, who anybody who knows anything about the outfit immediately thinks of Tony Joe Batters Accardo. But he wasn't by himself. He was with Ross Prio, a North Side vice boss, and an up-and-comer by the name of Sam Giancana.
So Sam, okay, this is the beginning of the rise of this guy. He didn't really have national prominence at that time. He was certainly known in Chicago. Why was he selected? Why did he go?
Sam bursts on the national scene at this time in 1957. Tony Accardo had taken over for the mafia in Chicago in about 1943 because Paul Ricca and many others were sent to prison. Well, Tony Accardo was facing a great deal of pressure from the IRS. And he had been in the outfit since the 20s. He goes way back to Al Capone and before. He wanted to step out of the limelight a little bit, to take a little bit of the pressure off himself. And he had Sam Giancana, who he had been training over the last 10 years, that he had decided to anoint as his street boss or front boss. So at a mob meeting at a country club, the Tam O'Shanter, Accardo simply stood up, walked over and put his arm on the shoulder of Sam Giancana and said, "I'd like you to meet a friend of mine, Sam Giancana." And that was just months, maybe 2 months before the Appalachian meeting.
He didn't necessarily want to relinquish power, though, at that time, right? He just wanted out of the spotlight.
I would agree with that, and that's something we'll definitely talk about.
Yeah.
But Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca maintained ultimate power. But Sam Giancana became the man in the spotlight, and he really relished it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he liked the attention.
So I have heard the story from Paul about the anointing at the country club, but Cam, is that the only version of how Sam was made?
There is a popular story online that's sort of grown up that because Giancana represented this growing power, the Italian community that had just flooded and was maturing on Taylor Street, and Giancana was also favored by Paul Ricca, that Giancana had this army of heavy hitters under him, and the Caifano brothers and Chucky Nicoletti and all these guys who were really shooting up in the ranks. Giancana had the muscle to basically take from Accardo what Accardo was not going to give to him, and that he was inevitable in his power rise. And so they were arguing in the car, presumably. They were driving back to Accardo's house, this giant house he had in River Forest. And so Accardo gets out of the car, and he's done with the argument, and he's walking towards the house, and the story is that Giancana fires a shot over his head and strikes the window. And it's not in any newspapers or anything at the time, I think, and it was in a newspaper, but yeah, that's right.
reported
It
in the
was
news.
reported, but they owned the newspapers at the time, and a lot of people like this story because they say, well, Taylor Street is where the power was, and Giancana ran Taylor Street, which is, the Italian section. And I know a lot of people like to bump up their myths and say, well, Giancana this and drama and power struggle, and it's this really great sort of Machiavellian twist on what's going on in the outfit, but I don't know about taking a shot at Joe Batters.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, what are the odds of that, Joe?
What are the odds of that? But do you think that something like that was possible? Somebody take a shot over his head? I mean, look at when they broke into his house and they robbed Ricardo's house. Those guys didn't fare so well.
I mean, when they
Even the housekeeper didn't fare well in that story.
he killed
Well,
guys
let's talk about that for a second. So Joe brings up a very good point. Ricardo served, 5 decades, right, at, the top boss, and somebody gets the wise idea to break into his house. What happened to those people? You guys want to fill us in?
Well, all 7 of them wound up trunk music, including some of the people who were sent out to kill them. And as Joe pointed out, the houseman who was in charge of the house when this happened also wound up gone.
Guys who happened to be with those guys when they were found ended up dead.
Who was the guy that did the lie detector test to turn it in ahead of time? So
Yeah, but
because he was
Siegel.
scared. Siegel?
The beak.
The beak, yeah.
Beak Siegel, yes, he went and had a lie detector test taken and had it delivered to Ricardo's lawyers. So he demonstrated, I have nothing to do with this. And this is the fear that this guy engendered. Now, I understand it's 1957. Anastasia's just been killed in New York. Costello's just been shot in New York. So there is this feeling of transition. But I think it's important that we settle this if we can right here because it's foundational to who Giancana was. He either was the ultimate boss of the outfit or he was essentially the street boss who had a lot of power on his own but ultimately answered to Rica and Ricardo. And in my opinion, nobody takes a shot at Tony Ricardo. If you don't kill him, you're a dead man.
Yeah,
Well, there's the other story too that goes along with that where he was in the spotlight, Giancana, but he was still behind the scenes taking orders or running certain things by Rica and Ricardo.
Right, and there's the old story that we don't know if it's true or not, that when he went, and we'll talk about this later, when Giancana sued the FBI, that the headline in the Sun-Times, that big, thick, heavy paper that it used to be, that Ricardo slapped him across the face with the headline, "What the hell are you doing?" You don't do that if this is a guy who just put a bullet in your family's house.
Yeah. I don't know. I think you can put that story to rest as online chatter.
And it served Ricardo's purposes for that story to be believed. I think he wanted people to think that Giancana took over. That was the whole purpose.
You think they orchestrated that?
I think so.
Sure.
I think so. I think they wanted it in the paper. They wanted it in law enforcement's consciousness that he was out. They wanted him to be left alone.
Which begins this whole idea of the mob is not just going to work in its own cult-like way. It brings its tentacles spread out into the law enforcement, into the press, into whoever they need in politics to be able to gain influence. And so this is the beginning, engendering of that kind of activity.
Correct.
But, Giancana didn't really need any reason to be portrayed as somebody who was tough. I mean, this guy had an incredibly tough life and came up as many of the Italian immigrants did. But so let's dive into where his psychology is. So before he becomes this boss, the making of the boss has to start on the core of the boy. And what happened to him as a child? What do we know about that?
Yeah, brutal childhood.
Very tough upbringing.
Yeah.
Born in 1908. His father was a very strict disciplinarian. He would get angry at Sam, who was out doing things he shouldn't be doing. But he would tie him to a tree in the backyard and whip him with a razor strap. And a lot of nights, he left him hang there until the next morning. At 2 years old, his mother died. Medicine wasn't very advanced. They lived in essentially a tenement. She was just taken to the hospital to die. And shortly thereafter, in another 18 months, his stepmother comes into his life. She is then later killed in a traffic accident. And so he suffers trauma after trauma after trauma, and he's living in this Italian neighborhood where the police are predominantly Irish and Polish. They don't present any sense of protection at all to Sam and his family. They don't care about the Italians. So Sam looks for a surrogate family and winds up finding one that shaped the rest of his life.
And what was that family?
You see, the 42s, the 42 gang, basically. And the story goes that Alibaba, which would have been popular reading for kids, it wasn't like they had cartoons and things to watch. So it was Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. And these guys look at the story and they're like, well, we're better than them. We're at least 2 better, so we're the 42s. And, 2 is more than 40, and all Alibaba had was his 40 guys. So they call themselves the 42s. There's a couple hundred of them, and they were brutal, and they kept themselves focused in the mostly in the Italian communities, but they would do anything. They would steal shirts and sell shirts. There were assaults. There were robberies. There were rape. I mean, these kids were running wild in this, and I think what we wonder now is why didn't somebody like the outfit stop them? But where they were operating basically was a relatively new Italian community versus some of the more established in Chicago. So along Taylor Street was where Italians had come pouring in from the 20s and the 30s. So, which is about when this gang operated during the 20s and the early part of the 30s. So they're sort of sticking to their own people, just like you see a lot in New York. Is you go with what you know and you victimize the people that are close to. And, they're stealing cars, they're shooting it out in the streets with cops. I mean, they had just, with absolute reckless abandon. And Giancana rose to the top in this group. I mean, he was an incredible wheelman. He could outdrive any cop. He carried a gun. He was charged with how many murders, Paul, before he was...
3 murders before the age of 20.
Right. He was a busy guy.
But this was a junior group, but it wasn't just Giancana. There were some other Chicago up-and-comers that came out of that group.
Sure, the Battaglias, Nicoletti, Aldericio, the Cafano brothers. This was a really
rough,
tense group of guys that would stay with Sam Giancana for the rest of his life.
And Felix Aldericio was connected to your family, Joe.
He was, yeah.
To your father.
That's where one of the 3 names that my parents had that they were choosing was Joey, Felix, and Erwin.
So you're lucky you didn't get named after Erwin Weiner.
Thank you so much. I'm not much of a Felix, so I like Joey. Joey's good.
Yeah, I don't see you as a Felix.
No.
So there's different crews and there's different gangs, like the Chinatown crew and so forth. Give me a breakdown. How do these crews and gangs work in the city of Chicago?
Before you do that, can we go into this is a junior gang, if you want to call them, that's running the streets. But a lot of times those junior, the people that are in those clubs, like you say, it's a farm team, but they don't always go to the outfit.
That's right.
Some will go to motorcycle clubs, some will go to the outfit, some go into law enforcement.
Yeah.
But they all start in that centralized area.
Well, that's how Sam started.
Yeah.
He got involved with Paul the waiter, Rika. And Rika's mentor was a gangster by the name of Diamond Joe Esposito.
Right.
Rika wanted to move up, and as is common in this business, he decided Diamond Joe had outlived his usefulness. And he reached out to a street tough by the name of Sam Giancana. And the word has always been that Sam was involved in the offing of Diamond Joe Esposito, which moved up Paul Rika, and all of a sudden got the attention of the outfit for Sam Giancana.
Right.
Do you know how Rika got his name, the waiter?
Well, he was at the Bella Napoli, a waiter and a manager of Diamond Joe Esposito's restaurant. He had fled Italy for 2 murders, and he was known as Paul the waiter. Now, of course, the outfit guys didn't call him the waiter. He was known as Mr. Paul to the guys in the outfit. But in the media, forever, he was Paul the waiter, because he was, in fact, a waiter.
So the media or the FBI came up with that?
Yeah, the media.
I
came
know
up
they
with
like to
that.
give them other people names too.
Yeah.
When you look him up on Wikipedia, it lists his occupation as waiter.
Yes.
So they need
Must
to
be true then.
update a little bit. But I think this is also traces a direct line with Capone too, because it was Capone that Esposito was starting to bump up against. You see, a guy like Esposito was involved in the politics in his area. If you think of it as kind of like a feudal lord, and what they had all over Chicago in these different areas. And Capone was trying to unify the city. That was basically the marching orders that were given to him by his mentor, Johnny Torrio. You unite the city, and then you've got a monopoly. And Esposito was not of the same material that Capone was, and certainly didn't have the power structure. And Capone and Rico were very close. And Rico would have been the inside man because he worked for Esposito. So this is where Rico stood against. He turned fully towards Capone, and because he very likely used Giancana here, this is probably where Giancana takes his first steps into the outfit power structure, moving up from a juvenile offender into that recognition by these higher powers. I mean, it was a big hit. It was in 1928.
Yes.
And when Esposito went down, that would have been a real stepping stone for Giancana.
Giancana's at this point, he's 20, 21 years old, something like that.
And this was 3 murders at least. And how does one get by with 3 murders?
Well, if witnesses disappear, it makes it difficult. And one of the murders has long been thought to have been the man who ran over his stepmother. He was actually in jail, waiting trial for another murder when the accident took place.
He's also a 42.
Yes, he was also a
42
fellow
gang member.
42.
Being in on the law side, do you see that happen a lot where witnesses disappear?
In Chicago? About at least 1,400 times.
Really? It's interesting.
Yes, it does happen.
They like
Listen,
just go on vacation? Or?
Well, they do that, or they just don't come home sometimes. People run away.
What is the total number of unsolved? Isn't there like it's well over 1,000, right?
It's like 1,400.
I think it is about
It's
1,400.
a pretty substantial book that Johnson wrote.
Wayne Johnson.
Wayne Johnson wrote, compiling all the unsolved murders. I believe it was 1,400 in some
Unsolved outfit murders?
unsolved outfit
Yes.
murders.
I mean, just that Family Secrets, that was pretty recent, and they only did roughly half of the murders that they had
Right.
information on. They only processed half of them.
Right. The 17, was it, that they took
It
care
was
of?
something, yeah, 18
And they left another 17 or 18 out there, right?
that are just, sitting.
That still puts them about 1,380 short.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess we got a lot of episodes then. One thing you brought up, Cam, that I think is also interesting for the viewers is this notion, you said that Capone was trying to unify, okay?
Correct.
Which is different wholly than the New York model for the mob, which was always the 5 families, right? 5 families, Gambino, Gotti, famous names. Here, we don't really have that in Chicago. What's the difference? How does it work here?
Well, there's quite a difference between New York and Chicago. And what you just said, Jim, is a good example. But even more fundamentally, New York is traditional Sicilian Cosa Nostra. And Chicago has never been that. They've always been a multi-ethnic organization. So at the very top, the way you get there is not by being Sicilian, though that helps, but by being an earner. So even in the Capone days, his top people, like Jake Guzik, were not Sicilians. Capone himself was not a Sicilian, which might have had something to do with it. He was a Neapolitan, if I remember correctly. So the Chicago outfit has always shared some principles with the mafia in New York, and they associate with them on the commission, but there's no formal making ceremony. Capone just said, I like you kids, so I make you. And that was it. And it didn't matter if you were Sicilian or Italian or Irish, as long as you could make money or do violence, then your talents were welcome with the outfit. And that's the major difference.
And but even then, they still had their separate crews who, again, nobody was talking to each other. You had crews in bordering towns that had no idea that there was a crew in another town. doing something.
Right, right.
They didn't get to the point of knowing everybody was
Yeah.
working till, I mean, how many years later?
Right.
Honestly, that came to pass. When you look at the breakdown of Capone's organization, it's really between 40 and 45% Italian, really. And that was when Capone and into Nitty's tenure. It was when Riga came forward and really reached into this developing Taylor Street area and really went into the Italian groups and picked up guys like Giancana and a lot of these younger up-and-coming guys. A guy like Paul Rica, who was also a Capone guy, but that's where he really expanded into what we know of as the modern outfit, and it transitioned over a few years into a 70% Italian organization. So that was where,
So almost double.
correct, and he really assembled things more along the lines of, a more traditional Italian structure with more traditional, what we think of as a mafia structure with, sort of a crew here and a crew there. And they were geographical areas. They weren't as tight as New York. You cover, 108th Street, 118th Street, but it was geographical and it was more plotted out. Whereas as Capone, it was a bit more pell-mell.
So let's zero in here on Giancana. So 3 murders, you said, not prosecuted, but eventually he runs into some trouble as a story that we start to see unfold against the Chicago mob, where people get accused of one thing and get put away for something else other than the thing that they might have committed. So what happened to Sam?
Well, 2 things at this point. We're talking the late 20s now. Mm-hmm. First is he fell in love with Angeline DeTalva. And before he could get her to marry him, Sam gets caught on a burglary rap. And what they were doing, the 42s, they would steal cars and then drive them through the plate glass window of dress shops and things like that and take all the inventory, then back out and sell it back home. Well,
So this is not a unique idea, this driving through the plate glass, because I think you can watch the local news in Chicago anytime. There's still people driving through.
Yeah.
they're still doing it.
It's not like, okay, very original.
What did they
Okay.
do with the cars?
What they do, they would strip them of everything that they could sell and leave the hulk on the street.
Just leave it?
They called them shorts. Mm-hmm. So that's how they'd pick up a short, drive it through a window, then strip it, take everything and sell what they could, then go get another one. And that's how Sam really became the guy of the reputation he was, because he could drive a car like nobody else. Mm-hmm. But then he gets caught in 1929 and goes to prison.
And how long is he in for?
He's in there for about 3 to 4 years. And when he comes out, he still wants Angeline. And she had met somebody else. My speculation is that things didn't go well for that gentleman. But Sam was able to convince Angeline to marry him in 1933, and he decided to go straight.
What jail was he in? Do you know?
What jail? Cook County jail.
Cook County?
And then he went to Stateville.
That's a nice place.
Oh, it's a lovely place. It was really nice in 1929, too.
So
You're right.
this
I don't think
part,
it's changed since
Running water and everything.
It's not been updated.
No.
Running water and everything.
Yeah.
this is crazy. This phrase you just said, he tries to go straight.
Yeah.
Okay, we got to hear about that. What does that mean? First of all, leopard and the spots. I mean, we never hear about somebody going straight and staying straight. So what happens? What does he do?
Sam genuinely loved his wife, and he loved her family, and they were very upstanding citizens. They were not interested in any of this criminal nonsense, and they put up a substantial bit of resistance to Sam marrying their daughter in the first place. Part of the deal was Sam was going to go straight. So they got him a job in an envelope factory, which, of course, in those days, Chicago was populated with printing and that kind of industry, and he tried to go straight. He honestly did. And he actually worked the job for a while.
How long you think that was?
An hour and a half?
No, actually for a couple of years,
I mean,
would
making
say.
3 cents an hour.
Is this where the
know,
phrase "pushing the envelope" comes from?
pushing the envelope?
Yes. Yes.
So he's working, yeah, and it's true. Chicago was the center for graphic arts for decades. Of print companies, converting companies, still to this day is known for
meat,
that.
right?
And so he's trying to, as was said in Goodfellas, he's trying to be like a regular schnook.
Yeah.
He's gonna go to work and earn a wage. Was he satisfied with this?
Not for very long. He ran into a fella by the name of Machine Gun Jack McGurn. And you can tell by his name what he did for a living. And Machine Gun needed a driver, and there was nobody in Chicago better than Sam Giancana.
I mean, that is a scene, isn't it? I mean, you know, sitting there licking envelopes, and then all of a sudden there's a meeting. Machine Gun comes in like, hey, I heard you know how to drive through plate glass windows. I could use someone of your skill. And off goes the envelope. And
That seemed to be popular, though. We've talked to many other people, and if you were a good driver, man, you always had a job.
Absolutely. Giancana had a skill where he could take that old, he loved to drive high-powered light Chryslers. And he would take that old Chrysler and he'd go around the corner and lift it onto the right wheels.
Nice.
And continue through the corner without flipping the car. And he was well known for that. And of course, the police and their heavy Cadillacs, they couldn't keep up with him.
So what year was this? I'm just trying to picture
this was
the
in
car.
the middle 30s.
Okay.
So, and he had developed a fondness for Chryslers back in the 42 days. So he stuck with them. And so he gets Machine Gun's attention, and then he begins driving for Paul Ricca, who at this time is really running things in the background for Frank Nitti, even though Frank Nitti may not have been fully aware of it.
And Nitti was the boss that took over for Capone when Capone went away.
Absolutely right. And as Camillus will point out to me later, his real name was actually
Frank Nitto, yeah, it's Nitto. He became Nitti on the show, the 60s show, The Untouchables. They started calling him Frank Nitti, and that has since stuck. You go to his stone, it says Nitto. And it was always Nitto in the old newspapers, but I don't know, I guess Nitti was catchier.
Now,
Some,
was that his,
some
was that
writer
his real
wanted
name?
like that. Nitto, ditto, I'm
Nitto?
gonna make it Nitti. You know?
You know, a lot of them, when they came off of the boat, they were all changing their names.
Oh, yeah.
You know, in multiple different ways. Even if it was a whole family, 3 of them would have different spellings of their
That's
last
right.
name.
right. And it was even true with Giancana, who there was some confusion. Was it Giancana? Was it Giancana?
Giancana.
And eventually it was straightened out because the midwife went and filled out the paperwork and filled it out wrong. And Giancana fixed it when he was up for the draft, and then later when he needed a passport to leave the country.
That's right.
Salvatore Momo Giancana.
And that was his nickname.
Where
later.
did the Momo come from? Yeah.
That was his name. That was his name. And they called him Mooney because he was so unpredictable. And that's what his friends would call him, or Sam the Cigar.
And in the newspapers going back to 1942, I'd call him Mooney.
In different spellings, right?
Yeah.
So now we're moving up through the 30s, time of the Depression. Definitely crime is starting to enter the public consciousness again with the reporting of mainly bank robbers and so forth, and murderers too. But the mob wasn't really still that well known, so he's really part of the underground.
Yeah.
But he starts to earn again.
He does, and he gets greedy. And he gets involved in, now, Prohibition has been repealed, but there's still a market for tax-free alcohol. And Sam sets up a
This is
still.
kind of like today where we have legalized marijuana, but people still buy from their local dealer.
You bet. Or it is just like on the streets of the city, you can buy a pack of untaxed cigarettes from some kid who's in a street gang for $7 a pack. It's a big source of income for organized crime, always has been. So Sam sets a still up in Boone County, which is just west of the city, and gets caught and does his first and only federal bid.
Where west of the city?
Well, Boone County is northwest of the city. So if you go up to Lake County and take a left, you wind up in Belvedere.
So he thought he was probably, in those days, that doesn't sound that far from us right now, but in those days, that was probably a haul.
Oh, yeah, and nothing but farms.
Wide open
and
farm.
things.
Yeah.
It's all country.
It's out in the sticks.
Right, it was way out there.
So he had his still out there, and he was still, in a sense, he was rum running,
He was.
but he gets busted. How does he get nabbed? Do you know the story on that?
I don't know how he got nabbed. Somebody talked, but we don't know who it was. And there's only one picture that survives of Sam out at that site. And we don't know so much about that operation, but I don't think it was very successful. And it wound up catching him what we call a headache. And he went to federal prison.
Did you hear a recent story of in Tennessee, somebody actually uncovered one of Capone's original stills? It was still in the hills.
Wow.
Yeah. It's kind of neat. Just because you were talking about a still.
It'd be a neat thing to come across, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. God. If it was proved that was his.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Back where I'm from, stills are plentiful. You go 30 minutes outside of where I was born, stills are plentiful.
Sure.
Still.
I had a
I
friend.
mean, they continue to be rather, no pun intended.
I had a friend in one of the couple of people I used to ride with, and he had one in his kitchen still.
Oh, yeah.
It was the best tasting stuff, I hear.
Well, the liquor business gave birth to obviously a lot of stuff, both coasts, all the way up to Joseph Kennedy, which we will get to in another episode. But this is a common theme. I mean, that liquor is part of really the birth of the outfit. It certainly was essential to Capone. It was certainly essential to the thriving of the mob and the incredibly explosive growth.
It was really entirely coincidental. I mean, the fact that Prohibition happened to go in right when there was a huge wave of Italian immigrants coming from southern Italy, right about the same time Benito Mussolini runs the organized crime guys, the mafia guys, the Camorra guys, the 'Ndrangheta guys. That's the organized crime groups in Italy. Right at the same time Benito Mussolini happens to run them out, the same time immigrants are pouring into these poor sections is the exact same time that Uncle Sam says, hey, y'all want to make a little bit of money? Y'all are making your own alcohol anyway, because that's what Italian peasants do. If you want a few $1 billion, it's yours. It wasn't so much that Italians are fundamentally criminal, it's just that they were new immigrants, and here's a huge source of revenue. And because they were able to generate billions of dollars in the 30s, that just propagated this entire movement. I mean, I think that people don't really look at it in a historical context. They just think, oh, well, Italians just brought the mafia over and they just stayed mafia. But it was really entirely timing.
That is totally the heritage. I mean, my father, Pasquale Anthony Forni, one of the famous stories he would always talk about is making dandelion wine, because they were so poor, they would pick dandelions out of the backyard and they learned how to make wine out of it.
Yeah.
So they knew how to make liquor out of anything.
Yeah.
But also the part of the government, we've talked to other people that have said that they're just businessmen, and they set up their businesses, and then the government says, oh, you're making money, let us take it over from you or prosecute you for it, and then the government screws it up by their usual taxing it or
Oh, you mean like the lottery?
something like that. Yeah.
That's what payday loans?
That was one of those,
Payday
right?
loans?
That's a good juice loan, right?
Right, that's right.
35%
Video
interest.
poker?
Video poker, the current, yeah.
So true.
See, these are the great contributions of the Chicago outfit to the culture of Chicago and beyond.
So they've just been persecuted businessmen their entire life.
I've heard that.
We've
Right.
solved this finally, once and for all. So Giancana serves his first federal stint, and only federal stint?
Yeah, unless you would count his contempt sentence in the 60s. And that was served at the Cook County Jail. So here he went to Leavenworth. He hated it so much, he somehow got himself transferred in 60 days to Terre Haute.
How did he do that?
I don't know how he
was
managed
it-
to grease
just
They
that
that.
didn't have
Sneeze?
phones. He didn't pick up a phone and make
Right.
a phone call. It was a
No, he
note
managed.
that was passed, and
It indicates that he probably had a little more grease than we realized at that time. So we don't know.
and what year did he come out at Terre Haute?
43.
Yeah, it was, but the connections he made in Terre Haute would really change the structure of Sam's trajectory going forward. That was, like they say, you go to prison is like criminal college, and because what Sam learned in prison was really what would lead to his rise in the
Are
outfit.
you telling me that Sam Giancana didn't get redemption and get rehabilitated in jail? Instead, he engendered a whole nother criminal enterprise by learning it in jail?
It
This
was
is shocking.
sad how it happened, but it did.
Summa cum laude, maybe.
Magna cum laude. So,
But we've also seen in other movies and stuff where people like Giancana go to jail, and it's like, they're getting steaks and lobsters and they're cooking, and it's a soft, time for them. Back in this time, do you think it was similar for Giancana like that, or no?
I don't-
You think his time was, he was serving
I think
time?
he was serving time.
Yeah.
I think he was too, but he was with other gangsters
Yeah.
that we'll talk about later that made it a lot easier because he took the opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
And learn he did.
so what was the key thing that he learned in federal prison that launched the next part of his career?
So while Giancana was in prison, he made the acquaintance of a black gangster who ran what was called Policy in Bronzeville, basically throughout the entire city. Policy is an informal lottery. In New York and other parts of the country, you call it the numbers. You're playing the numbers. And this was an empire that they had built, basically. Policy is you pick three numbers, 1 to 78, right, Paul?
Yes.
And so you choose these three numbers, and they use, it's called a policy wheel. And they spin the wheel and draw the numbers. And their policy wheels set all up. I mean, you can have three wheels on a corner because it's just more money you're putting in. You put a nickel, you put a dime, you put however, and you pay for these numbers, and then you hope that your number hits. But Policy ran out to the west side. It ran as far east as Gary, up north to Evanston, and all of Bronzeville. And at the time, these guys were taking in $18 to $20 million. And this was in the mid 30s.
Back in the 30s?
Right, so that's between $350 and $380 million today that these guys were making. And Big Eddie Jones was trying to make some inroads into the Italian mafia. And so he and Sam team up, and Sam's trying to make inroads into anything that makes money. And so they team up, they get to know each other. Eddie shows them the ropes in prison. They get out, and Eddie stakes Sam for $200,000, I believe it was. That's $200,000 in 1942.
It's like $4 million.
$4 million gives this little Italian guy $4 million, which was, in a way, he was trying to buy into the outfit, which would then lead to problems with his own community. Because one thing about Policy is it does keep the money in the community. And a lot of people say, well, the ills of gambling, but it also, a lot of businesses were owned in the community, and all the money stayed there, and it kept real political power within, that rivaled the Italian power as far as voting in Chicago and everything. So it was a real source of power in the communities of Bronzeville and communities of color in the West Side. So this was a major part of Chicago for communities of color. And Sam Giancana was basically given the keys to the kingdom. But at the time, Eddie Jones thinks he's got a partner. Eddie Jones is getting older. He sees this younger guy. He's going to make partnerships with the Italian mob. And he and Sam have been together for years in prison. They're a great relationship.
But it doesn't go as planned. And in next week's episode, we're going to discuss the policy wars of Chicago.